Recently, I ran into a really interesting interview on Facebook that a good friend of mine had posted, where an Islamic cleric was being interviewed on the subject of wife abuse. Yeah, really kind of disturbing subject. When asked when you could and couldn't hit your wife, he said, well, you can hit her, but you can't hit her in the face. And you can't hit her too much. You can't hit her to the point that she can't get up. And you can only hit her only if she's refusing to have sex with you. Yeah, sounds pretty awful, doesn't it? And I'm sure that's why this video was circulating so much. And to top it all off, the cleric said this Muhammad did to honor women. What on earth does that mean? Well, believe it or not, he was right. This was something Muhammad did to honor women. And before everyone explodes and gets upset, I am going to try to explain. See, a lot of people kind of see Muhammad as having come into a region where everyone was just sort of a blank slate. And he came in and said, okay, you should do this, and you should do this, and you should do that. What they don't realize is that Muhammad was actually an extreme reformer. And what he was trying to reform was this extremely barbaric, ancient tribal culture, which is what all the Arabic tribes had in the Middle East at the time. And when he said, you can hit your wife, that wasn't really what he was saying. See, up until Muhammad, you could hit your wife for any reason. You could just beat her to death. You could do anything you wanted. And what Muhammad was actually trying to do was limit that, was stop people from beating their wives, or I guess the best he could do at the time was stop them from beating them so much. The reason he said you couldn't beat them in the face was actually because if you beat a woman in the face and she lost her looks, she couldn't be remarried. She was kind of ruined as a person, which of course was a very bad thing. A lot of the things he did when he was an iconoclast, which means he came into this culture where all these different tribes each had a different god. Everyone had a different god. And he was trying to bring them together. And so he destroyed all the idols. He said, okay, there's only one God now. La ilaha illallahu. There is no God but God, Allah. He said, you can no longer kill your daughters. See, there was a time when if you were a couple and you had a child and it wound up not being a boy, and of course most people wanted boys, if it was a daughter, you could just kill them. And he said, you can't do that anymore. That is completely barbaric, and you can't do that. When he said you could have 4 wives, for instance, he wasn't saying you can have 4 wives. He was limiting it to 4. And he also said not only that, but you have to treat them all equally, which, as any guy I've ever known knows, is completely and utterly impossible. He also freed the slaves. When he came in, there were all kinds of horribly barbaric things that he was trying to either put an end to or limit as much as he possibly could, because these were things that were extremely ingrained in the tribal culture of the time. And believe it or not, women's rights was a very big deal to him. In fact, one of the wives which he married, he actually married to prove a point. She was a widow. And at that time, you couldn't marry a sullied woman. In other words, you couldn't marry a woman that wasn't a virgin. So basically, very unfortunately, if a woman's husband died, she was destitute. No one could marry her. She was just left on her own. And so by marrying a widow, he was saying, yes, if a woman's husband died, you can still marry her. You know, because that was how you had to take care of them. That was the very basis of a lot of the laws at the time, which just like the Jewish laws. If a brother died, you might have to marry his wife to take care of her. That was the basis of a lot of these ancient tribal customs that had to do with marriages, and how women basically unfortunately were just destitute if they weren't married and there was no one to take care of them. And so if you look at it from that angle, from the angle that Muhammad was coming from, these were all reforms. These were all attempts to try to reform this barbaric culture. And it's extremely important when we look back on these things, because a lot of Christians even don't understand this. They look at this horribly barbaric concept of what they call Sharia law. You'll always hear this in the news, Sharia law, Sharia law. Sharia law is actually very similar to the kinds of laws that they had in the Old Testament, that the Jews had in the Old Testament. For instance, stoning prostitutes, stoning people in general. Fortunately, at some point, most Jews obviously decided that was a bad idea. Most Christians, things like this do still happen some places. You will occasionally get a report of some entire families being burned to death in Papua New Guinea for witchcraft. So it's not completely eradicated, but this does happen in Christian culture still, and of course it still happens in Islam in the more primitive countries. Needless to say, if you go to Jordan, you're going to get considerably less of that than you're going to get if you go to Iraq. But when talking about Muhammad, when thinking about ancient Islam, you really have to keep all of these things in mind. Because of course it's going to sound horrible when a cleric sits up there and says, Muhammad said that you could beat your wife, but not in the face, and this was to honor women. He really does mean it, but he may not either know exactly why that was. Some people have forgotten those things, or he may just think it's assumed, and may not state those kinds of things. So try to understand, Muhammad was a really cool guy. He really, really was. But yes, much like most great religious leaders of the ancient world, they were having to come in and reform very, very barbaric groups of people. So think about these things next time you hear something crazy about Islam. I'm the Urban Omnist. La ilaha illallahu. I'll see you guys on the next one. And remember guys, none of this works without you. So subscribe to our channel, like us on Facebook and Twitter, and above all, don't forget to send me those questions.